The galactic chart stops at human space, and everyone knows better than to ask. Why Kethvar stared at the holographic display floating above his desk, his three-fingered hands trembling slightly as he zoomed in on the problematic sector. The blue light from the star chart cast strange shadows across his gray Zentari features, making his large black eyes appear even more unsettled than usual. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. For the past 6 months, Kethvar had been working on updating the galactic trade routes for the mapping consortium. It was supposed to be simple work, the kind of job that kept junior cartographers busy while the senior staff handled the important surveys of new systems. But as he cross-referenced shipping manifests with navigational data, a pattern emerged that made no sense. The galaxy simply stopped. Not in the way that uncharted space normally appeared on maps, with gradual fading at the edges where exploration had yet to reach. This was different. This was a hard line drawn with mathematical precision across dozens of star systems. Beyond that line, the official chart showed nothing but empty space marked Restricted Zone, Navigation Prohibited. Kethvar had been mapping space for 12 years, ever since graduating from the Zentari Technical Academy. He had never seen anything like this. Restricted zones usually had explanations: dangerous radiation, unstable stars, or territorial disputes between member species. But this zone had no explanation at all. Just a boundary that stretched across nearly a tenth of the galaxy's rim. Strangest part was how old the restriction appeared to be. When Kethvar dug into the historical archives, he found the same boundary marked on charts dating back over 200 years. In all that time, as the galaxy expanded and new trade routes opened, as wars were fought and peace treaties signed, this one region remained untouched, unchanged, forbidden. He pulled up shipping records next. Surely someone had to know what lay beyond that line. Commerce drove exploration more than any government survey mission ever could. If there were resources or habitable worlds in that region, someone would have tried to profit from them. But the shipping lanes curved around, the restricted zone like water flowing around a stone. Not a single cargo manifest showed delivery coordinates beyond that boundary. Not one explorer's log mentioned attempting to cross it. It was as if an entire section of the galaxy simply did not exist in the minds of every spacefaring species. Kethvar's supervisor, Director Yolthes, was an ancient Zentari who had been with the mapping consortium for nearly a century. If anyone would know about this strange boundary, it would be her. Kethvar gathered his findings and requested a meeting. The director's office occupied the top floor of the consortium headquarters, with panoramic windows overlooking the sprawling city of Zentari Prime. Yolthes sat behind her massive desk, her age-spotted skin nearly white with years, her eyes clouded but still sharp. She listened in silence as Kethvar presented his discovery. "Director, I need to understand what I'm looking at," Kethvar said, highlighting the boundary on his portable display. "This restriction covers thousands of star systems. The energy expenditure alone to maintain such a large exclusion zone would be enormous, and yet there's no record of why it exists or who maintains it." Director Yolthes was quiet for a long moment, her gnarled hands clasped in front of her. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that Kethvar had never heard before. "Young cartographer, in my many decades of service, I have learned that some regions of space are marked as restricted for very good reasons, reasons that do not require explanation or documentation. But surely there must be some record. There are no records you need to concern yourself with." The director's tone became sharp. "Your assignment is to update trade routes in established space. I suggest you focus on that task." Kethvar felt a chill run down his spine. In all his years working for the consortium, he had never heard Director Yolthes speak in such a manner. Her usual scholarly curiosity had been replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like fear. "Director, I don't understand. As cartographers, isn't our job to map and understand the galaxy? How can we ignore such a large region of space?" Yolthes stood up slowly, her movements stiff with age. She walked to the window and gazed out at the city below. "Kethvar, you are a talented cartographer with a bright future ahead of you. Do not jeopardize that future by pursuing knowledge that serves no constructive purpose." "What knowledge? What's out there that's so dangerous it can't even be discussed?" The director turned back to face him, and Kethvar was shocked to see genuine fear in her ancient eyes. "Some boundaries exist not to keep things out, but to keep us from going where we do not belong. This conversation is over. Return to your assigned duties and do not bring this matter to my attention again." Kethvar left the director's office more confused than ever. In all his years of study and work, he had never encountered information That was simply forbidden to discuss. The galaxy was vast and full of wonders, but it was also thoroughly catalogued. Every star system had surveys. Every trade route had documentation. Every restricted zone had clear explanations. Except for this one. Back at his desk, Kethvar stared at the holographic display once more. The boundary line seemed to pulse with an ominous energy, dividing the known galaxy from whatever lay beyond. He began to notice other small details that he had missed before. Shipping routes didn't just avoid the restricted zone. They curved around it in patterns that suggested active effort to stay as far away as possible. Communication relay stations stopped well short of the boundary, creating dead zones in the galaxy's information network. Most disturbing of all, when Kethvar tried to access higher-level archives to research the zone's history, he found that his clearance had been mysteriously downgraded. Files that should have been available to any senior cartographer now showed access denied messages. Someone was watching his research. Someone wanted to make sure he stopped asking questions. But Kethvar had always been curious by nature. It was what made him good at his job, and it was what made him unable to simply ignore the mystery that had fallen into his lap. If the official channels wouldn't provide answers, he would have to look elsewhere. That evening, Kethvar sat in his small apartment, staring out at the stars visible through his window. Somewhere out there, beyond the edge of charted space, lay secrets that his own government was afraid to acknowledge. The thought both terrified and excited him. He had heard stories in the past. Fragments of conversation overheard in spaceport. Cantinas rumors passed between freight haulers who spent their lives traveling the galaxy's edge. Stories about ships that disappeared near certain coordinates. Stories about exploration teams that returned from deep space changed in ways that their families could never quite explain. Kethvar had always dismissed such tales as the usual collection of ghost stories that spread among people who spent too much time in the emptiness between stars. But now he wondered if those stories might contain grains of truth buried within the exaggeration. Tomorrow, he decided, he would begin a different kind of research. If the mapping consortium wouldn't tell him what lay beyond the boundary, perhaps he could find someone who would. Someone who had actually been there and lived to tell about it. The galaxy held many secrets, but Kethvar was beginning to suspect that the biggest secret of all was the one everyone agreed never to discuss. The galactic chart stops at human space, and everyone knows better than to ask. Why Kelos Station drifted at the edge of civilized space like a metal tumor growing in the darkness. The old mining platform had been converted into a trading post decades ago when the asteroid belt around it played out. Now it served as a stopping point for freight haulers, smugglers, and others who preferred to conduct their business far from the watchful eyes of galactic authorities. Kethvar had never been to such a place before. The corridors reeked of engine, fuel, and unwashed bodies. The lighting flickered constantly, casting moving shadows that made every corner seem dangerous. He kept his hands close to his sides and tried not to stare at the various species crowded into the narrow walkways, many of whom looked like they would happily rob him for the price of his next meal. The cantina occupied what had once been the station's main cargo bay. Mismatched tables and chairs filled the space, while a bar constructed from salvaged ship parts dominated one wall. The air was thick with smoke from a dozen different worlds, and the conversation was conducted in at least 6 languages that Kethvar could identify. He had come here looking for Jaxum, a Thorian freight hauler whose name kept appearing in the shipping records Kethvar had been studying. Unlike other captains who gave the restricted zone a wide berth, Jaxum's routes often skirted close to the boundary. If anyone might know something about what lay beyond it, it would be him. Kethvar found the Thorian sitting alone at a corner table, nursing a glass of something that glowed faintly green. Jaxum was typical of his species, tall and lean, with leathery brown skin and eyes that seemed too large for his narrow face. His clothes were practical spacer gear that had seen better decades, and his hands showed the permanent stains of someone who worked on ship engines more often than he paid others to do it. Jaxum? Kethvar approached the table carefully. My name is Kethvar. I work for the Galactic Mapping Consortium. I was hoping I could ask you some questions. The Thorian looked up with the weary expression of someone who had been expecting this conversation for a long time. Consortium, eh? Let me guess. You've been staring at star charts and wondering why there's a big empty spot where there should be trade routes. Kethvar felt his heart skip. You know about the restricted zone? Sit down before you attract attention, Jaxum said quietly. And buy me a drink. This conversation is going to require alcohol. Kethvar ordered 2 glasses of Altarian whiskey from a serving droid that looked like it might fall apart at any moment. The whiskey burned his throat, but Jaxum downed his glass in one smooth motion and gestured for another. How long have you been a cartographer? Jackson asked. 12 years. And in all that time, nobody ever told you about the quiet zone? Nobody ever explained why certain shipping routes make no sense? Nobody ever mentioned why freight haulers like me charge triple rates for runs that come within 50 light years of certain coordinates? No, I only discovered it by accident while updating trade routes. My supervisor told me to stop asking questions. Jackson laughed, but there was no humor in it. Of course she did. Smart woman. Probably wants to keep her job. What's out there? Kethvar leaned forward. What's so dangerous that the entire galaxy pretends it doesn't exist? Jackson was quiet for a long moment, staring into his second glass of whiskey. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. My grandfather told me stories when I was young. Stories that his grandfather had told him, stories about the old days before the Boundary Accord. The what? That's what the old-timers called it. The agreement that nobody talks about. The treaty that every major power signed but nobody admits exists. Jackson drained his glass again. You want to know what's out there? I'll tell you. But first you need to understand that knowledge like this has a price. People who know too much have a habit of disappearing. A chill ran down Kethvar's spine, but his curiosity was stronger than his fear. Tell me. Jackson leaned back in his chair, his large eyes focusing on something beyond the cantina walls. About 250 years ago, ships started disappearing, near what you call the restricted zone. Not all at once and not in any pattern that made sense. A cargo hauler here, an exploration vessel there, a military patrol ship somewhere else. The strange thing was some of them came back. What do you mean came back? Exactly that. Ships that had been missing for months would suddenly reappear at their home ports. The crews would be alive and healthy, but they'd be different. They'd file their reports, claim they'd had engine trouble or gotten lost in an asteroid field. But people who knew them could tell something had changed. Kethvar felt his hands beginning to shake. Changed how? They'd know things they shouldn't. No, a cargo captain might mention a trade dispute that hadn't been made public yet. A military officer might reference classified troop movements. An explorer might describe planets that hadn't been discovered. And when pressed for details, they'd get this look in their eyes, like they were remembering something they weren't supposed to share. The cantina seemed to grow quieter around them, as if the other patrons sensed the weight of the conversation taking place in the corner. Jackson continued his story, his voice taking on the rhythm of someone recounting an old legend. But the really strange part was what happened to those crews later. Within 6 months, sometime sooner, they'd start taking early retirement, selling their ships, moving to frontier worlds where nobody asked questions. And if you tried to contact them afterward, you'd find they'd simply vanished. No forwarding addresses, no communication logs, like they'd never existed at all. That's impossible, Kethvar said, but even as he spoke the words, he knew he didn't believe them. In a galaxy where information was power, the complete erasure of people was exactly the kind of thing that powerful organizations were capable of. My grandfather knew one of them, Jackson continued. A Zentari explorer named Kolthes, old friend of the family. Kol had been mapping systems near the edge when his ship went missing. 3 months later, he showed up at my grandfather's house looking like he'd aged 10 years in 3 months. What did he say happened? That's the thing, he wouldn't say. Claimed his navigation computer had malfunctioned and he'd spent the time drifting in empty space. But my grandfather noticed things. Kol would sometimes stop mid-sentence like he was listening for something nobody else could hear. He'd reference star systems that didn't exist on any chart. And once, when he thought nobody was listening, my grandfather heard him talking to himself in a language that didn't sound like anything in the galactic database. Jackson paused to order another drink. The serving droid's mechanical movement seemed unnaturally loud in the relative quiet that had settled over their corner of the cantina. 6 months later, Kol disappeared. Left behind a sealed message for my grandfather. All it said was, "The quiet ones are watching. Don't look for what you're not ready to find." Kethvar felt a cold weight settling in his stomach. The quiet ones? That's what Kol called them. The quiet ones who watch from the edge of everything. My grandfather spent years trying to understand what that meant. He collected stories from other freight haulers, other families who'd lost people to the zone. Always the same pattern, ships disappearing, crews returning changed, people vanishing. Within months. Did he ever find out what was really out there? Jackson's laugh was bitter. He tried. Bought himself a fast ship and headed for the boundary zone. That was 40 years ago. We never heard from him again. The weight of the story settled over Kethvar like a suffocating blanket. Everything Jackson had told him fit with the patterns he'd observed in the shipping data, the careful avoidance of certain coordinates, the gaps in the communication networks, the universal silence surrounding a region of space that should have been prime real estate for exploration and commerce. "Why are you telling me this?" Kethvar asked. "Because you're going to keep digging whether I tell you or not. I can see it in your eyes. Same look my grandfather had, same look Kolthes had before he disappeared. At least this way you'll know what you're getting into." Jackson stood up, leaving credits on the table to cover the drinks. "One last piece of advice, cartographer. If you do decide to go looking for answers, don't go alone, and don't trust any ship that offers to take you there too eagerly. The quiet ones have ways of knowing when someone is getting too close to their secrets." As Jackson walked away, disappearing into the crowd of traders and smugglers, Kethvar sat alone with his thoughts. The story he'd just heard should have sounded like the ravings of someone who'd spent too much time in deep space. But every detail matched the evidence he'd found in the official records. Somewhere beyond the edge of charted space, something was watching the galaxy. Something that had the power to make people disappear, to erase them so completely that even their existence became questionable. Something that the major galactic powers had decided was better left alone. Kethvar finished his whiskey and tried to decide whether his next step would be the smartest or stupidest thing he'd ever done. The galactic chart stops at human space, and everyone knows better than to ask why. The message arrived 3 days after Kethvar returned to Centauri Prime. It appeared on his personal communication device while he was eating breakfast, carrying the official seal of the Galactic Coalition Intelligence Division. The text was brief and left no room for interpretation. "Report to Level 847, Coalition Headquarters, Nexus Prime. Transport has been arranged. Do not delay." Kethvar had never been to Nexus Prime, the massive space station that served as the capital of the Galactic Coalition. As his shuttle approached the station, he was struck by its sheer size. The structure stretched for hundreds of kilometers, a gleaming metal city that housed representatives from every major species in the galaxy. Ships came and went in endless streams, carrying diplomats, trade officials, and information that shaped the destiny of countless worlds. Level 847 was deep in the station's security section, far from the public areas where tourists and journalists were allowed. Kethvar was escorted through multiple checkpoints, each one requiring more extensive identity verification than the last. By the time he reached his destination, he was certain that his entire life history had been scanned, analyzed, and filed away in some intelligence database. Agent Commander Velnox was waiting in a sterile conference room with no windows. The Altarian was tall and elegant, with the pale blue skin and silver hair typical of her species. But her eyes held the cold calculation of someone who made difficult decisions for the greater good of the galaxy. 2 other agents flanked her, a bulky Thorian and a reptilian Esskatar, who watched Kethvar with the predatory stillness of a natural hunter. "Cartographer Kethvar," Agent Commander Velnox said without preamble. "Please sit down. We need to discuss your recent research activities." Kethvar felt his mouth go dry. "My research? I'm just updating trade routes, nothing classified or sensitive." "On the contrary, your activities have triggered several security protocols. Accessing historical navigation data beyond your clearance level, questioning senior staff about restricted zones, making contact with individuals of questionable loyalty in frontier regions." Velnox opened a holographic display showing detailed records of Kethvar's activities over the past week. "You've been very busy for someone just updating trade routes." The display showed everything: his meeting with Director Yolthes, his trip to Kelos Station, even his conversation with Jackson in the cantina. The level of surveillance was terrifying, but what frightened Kethvar more was the implication that his questions had been important enough to attract attention from the highest levels of galactic intelligence. "I don't understand," Kethvar said. "I was just curious about an empty region on the star charts. Why does that warrant intelligence involvement?" Agent Commander Velnox exchanged glances with her companions before responding. "Because that empty region isn't empty, cartographer, and your curiosity has brought you to the attention of people who take galactic security very seriously." She manipulated the holographic display, zooming in on the familiar boundary that had started Kethvar's investigation. But now the display showed additional information: classification levels, security protocols, and warning markers that extended far beyond what appeared on standard navigation charts. "What you call the restricted zone is officially designated as human space," Velnox said. "It is home to a species that represents the single greatest potential threat to galactic stability. A species so dangerous that 3 major galactic powers signed an unprecedented non-aggression pact to ensure they remain contained. Human? Kethvar had never heard of such a species. I don't understand. If they're so dangerous, why isn't there any record of them in the standard databases? Because the standard databases were specifically designed to exclude them. The Thorian agent spoke for the first time, his voice like grinding stone. The Treaty of Silent Boundaries was signed 237 years ago. The treaty required the systematic removal of human-related information from all public records. Kethvar felt the room spinning around him. You're telling me that an entire species was erased from galactic history? That's impossible. Is it? Agent Commander Velnox manipulated the display again, showing him classified reports that dated back centuries. The humans appeared in our region of space approximately 300 years ago. No one knew where they came from. Their home system wasn't on any chart. Their technology followed principles that our scientists couldn't understand. Their methods of warfare were unlike anything we'd ever encountered. The reports that flashed across the display painted a picture that made Kethvar's blood run cold. Entire star systems reduced to uninhabitable waste. Fleets that vanished without trace. Planets that surrendered without a shot being fired after their military leaders received anonymous messages that demonstrated impossible knowledge of their defensive capabilities. At first, we assumed they were another expansion-minded species, like the Thorians or the old Kelgan Empire. Velnox continued. We prepared for conventional warfare. Territory disputes, resource conflicts, the usual pattern of first contact with aggressive species. But humans didn't follow conventional patterns. The Sikatar agent spoke, his sibilant voice carrying undertones of old fear. They didn't conquer territory, they solved problems. A trade dispute that had lasted for decades would suddenly resolve itself after human ships were spotted in the system. Pirate fleets that had terrorized shipping lanes for years would simply disappear. Revolutionary movements that threatened stability would collapse overnight. They were helping? Kethvar asked. That was what made them so terrifying, Velnox replied. They weren't conquering us, they were managing us. Every conflict that erupted, every crisis that developed, humans would appear and fix it with methods that defied explanation. They demonstrated capabilities that suggested they understood our societies better than we understood ourselves. The holographic display shifted to show battle reports from the few direct conflicts that had occurred. The details were horrifying in their clinical efficiency. Human forces that were outnumbered 1,000 to 1 would achieve complete victory through tactics that seemed to anticipate every move their enemies would make. Diplomatic negotiations where human representatives would arrive knowing details about their counterparts' personal lives, private fears, and hidden motivations that should have been impossible to obtain. The breaking point came during the Andromedas campaign, the Thorian agent said. A joint Thorian-Altarian-Seskatar force of over 10,000 ships moved to contain human expansion. The humans met them with fewer than 50 vessels. What happened? Kethvar asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. The human fleet broadcast a single message, Velnox said. It contained detailed tactical analyses of every ship in the Allied force, complete psychological profiles of every commanding officer, and precise predictions of how the battle would unfold over the following 6 hours. Then they offered the Allied commanders a choice: withdraw immediately and avoid the unnecessary loss of life, or proceed with an engagement that would result in complete defeat within 3 hours and 17 minutes. Kethvar stared at the display. They could predict the future. They could predict us, the Eskatar agent corrected. Every decision we might make, every tactical response we might attempt, every weakness we might try to exploit. It was as if they had been studying our species for centuries, learning how we think and fight and negotiate. The Allied commanders chose to withdraw. That withdrawal led to the Treaty of Silent Boundaries, Velnox continued. Every major power agreed that humans represented a threat that couldn't be conquered or contained through conventional means. They were simply too effective, too knowledgeable, too far ahead of us in ways that we couldn't understand. So we chose the only option that made sense. You decided to ignore them? We decided to give them what they seemed to want: isolation. In exchange, they agreed to remain within designated boundaries and limit their intervention in galactic affairs. The treaty established the current restricted zone, removed all human-related information from public records, and created the conspiracy of silence that has kept the peace for over 2 centuries. Kethvar sat in stunned silence, trying to process what he had learned. An entire species, more advanced and dangerous than anything the galaxy had ever encountered, was living just beyond the edge of explored space. And every government, every military, every intelligence agency in the galaxy had agreed to pretend they didn't exist. "Why are you telling me this?" he finally asked. "Because your investigation has already brought you close to information that could destabilize galactic society," Velnox replied. "If knowledge of human existence became public, it would cause panic. Trade routes would collapse as merchants refused to travel near their space. Military budgets would skyrocket as governments prepared for conflicts they couldn't win. The careful balance of power that has maintained peace for centuries would crumble." The Thorian agent leaned forward. "We are offering you a choice, cartographer. Join our organization and help maintain the security that protects billions of lives. Or return to your normal duties with the understanding that your curiosity has reached its natural limits. The galactic chart stops at human space, and everyone knows better than to ask why Kethvar had accepted Agent Commander Velnox's offer, though he suspected he'd had little real choice in the matter. For 3 months he worked as a consultant for the intelligence division, using his cartographic expertise to monitor shipping patterns near sensitive zones. It was important work, but it felt hollow. Every chart he updated, every route he verified, carried the weight of the secrets he now knew. The assignment that changed everything seemed routine at first. A coalition research vessel, the Meridian Explorer, had been conducting mineral surveys in the outer rim when their navigation computer suffered a critical malfunction. The ship was drifting in deep space, dangerously close to the boundary of human space. Kethvar was part of the rescue team sent to retrieve the crew and their data before they crossed into restricted territory. The rescue ship Valiant Dawn was a fast courier vessel equipped with military-grade sensors and communication arrays. Captain Zorthak, a veteran Ekatar officer with more years in deep space than most species lived, commanded the mission with the kind of professional competence that came from decades of handling delicate situations. Estimated time to target, 12 hours at current velocity, the navigation officer reported as they dropped out of hyperspace. The Meridian Explorer is holding position approximately 47 light-years from the nearest boundary marker. Kethvar monitored the sensor displays from his position at the cartographic station. The familiar edge of charted space stretched across the screen like a wall of darkness. Beyond it lay the vast region that officially didn't exist, though Kethvar now knew better. Somewhere in that emptiness humans were watching and waiting, their purposes unknown but their capabilities terrifyingly clear. "Sir, I'm detecting some unusual readings," the sensor operator reported. "The Meridian Explorer's position has shifted. They're now only 38 light-years from the boundary." Captain Zorthak's scaled head turned toward the display. "Are they under power?" "Negative, sir. Engine signatures show they're still dead in space, but they appear to be drifting toward the restricted zone." A cold realization settled over Kethvar. "Captain, there's a gravitational anomaly in this region, an uncharted stellar remnant that creates drift patterns toward the boundary. If the Meridian Explorer has been drifting for days without maneuvering power, they could cross into human space before we reach them," Captain Zorthak finished. "Navigation, plot an intercept course, maximum velocity." The Valiant Dawn surged forward, her engines straining against the demands for speed. But even as they raced toward the stranded research vessel, Kethvar could see from the sensor readings that it would be close. The Meridian Explorer was drifting steadily toward the invisible line that marked the boundary of official galactic space. Hours passed in tense silence. The crew went about their duties with the mechanical precision of professionals, but Kethvar could sense the underlying tension. Everyone aboard the Valiant Dawn knew what would happen if a coalition vessel crossed into human space. The carefully maintained treaty that had preserved peace for over 2 centuries could unravel in moments. "Contact established with the Meridian Explorer," the communications officer announced. "Captain Yolmat reports crew of 47 all safe. Main engines are completely offline, but they have auxiliary power for life support and communications." "Tell them to prepare for emergency docking," Captain Zorthak ordered. "We'll take them aboard and salvage what we can from their ship." But as they closed the distance to the stranded vessel, the sensor readings became increasingly disturbing. The Meridian Explorer had crossed the 30 light-year mark, then the 25. With each passing hour, she drifted closer to territory that no coalition ship had entered in over 2 centuries. "Sir," the navigation officer said quietly, "at current drift rates, the Meridian Explorer will cross the boundary in approximately 6 hours. We can reach them in 4. "Then we have a window," Captain Zorthak replied, but Kethvar could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The uncertainty became fear when their long-range sensors detected something impossible. Captain, the sensor operator's voice was tight with disbelief. I'm reading a large artificial structure moving through human space. Distance approximately 15 light-years beyond the boundary. It's on an intercept course with the Meridian Explorer's drift trajectory. Captain Zorthak moved to the sensor station, his scaled hands working the controls with practiced efficiency. Specifications? Unknown configuration, sir. Length approximately 8 kilometers. No energy signatures that match known propulsion systems, but it's definitely under power. Estimated arrival at the boundary. 3 hours. The bridge fell silent except for the hum of ship's systems. Everyone aboard the Valiant Dawn understood what they were looking at. For the first time in centuries, a human vessel was approaching the boundary between their hidden territory and the rest of the galaxy. Sir, we need to reach the Meridian Explorer before that thing does, the tactical officer said. But Kethvar was studying the sensor readings more carefully, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Captain, I don't think they're coming for the research vessel. Look at these trajectory projections. He transferred his analysis to the main display, showing the human ship's course plotted against galactic navigation charts. The vessel wasn't heading directly for the Meridian Explorer. It was moving toward a star system where, according to Kethavar's intelligence briefings, a minor territorial dispute between the Kelgan Empire and the Arcturus Federation was threatening to escalate into open warfare. They're not responding to our situation, Kethavar said quietly. They're responding to something else entirely. Something happening in the Proxima Kelgan system. Captain Zorthak accessed the tactical communication network, his expression growing more troubled as he read the classified reports. Kelgan battle groups have been massing near Arcturus trade routes. Federation forces are moving to intercept. Both sides are claiming the other fired first. The humans know, Kethvar realized. Somehow they know about the conflict before it's even been officially reported. They're moving to intervene. The implications were staggering. For over 2 centuries, human forces had remained within their designated boundaries, content to observe the galaxy from a distance. But now they were actively moving into potentially contested space, approaching a conflict that could destabilize an entire sector. Sir, we have a problem, the communications officer announced. I'm monitoring military frequencies. Both Kelgan and Federation commanders are detecting the human vessel on their long-range sensors. They're demanding explanations from Coalition Command. Captain Zorthak moved to his command chair, his movements showing the weight of command decisions. Send a priority message to Coalition Intelligence. Inform them that human space containment may have been breached. Request immediate orders. Sir, message sent. But at this distance we won't receive a reply for at least 2 hours. Then we proceed with the rescue mission, Captain Zorthak decided. But we monitor that human vessel, if it crosses the boundary. He didn't need to finish the thought. Everyone aboard the Valiant Dawn understood that they might be witnessing the end of the treaty that had maintained galactic peace for centuries. As they closed the final distance to the Meridian Explorer, Kethvar watched the sensor displays with growing fascination and terror. The human vessel moved with purpose and precision, its course calculated to arrive at the Proxima Kelgan system, exactly when military analysts predicted the conflict would reach its critical phase. How do they know? He whispered to himself. But the question echoed in his mind with increasing urgency. How did humans, isolated in their restricted space for over 200 years, have such precise knowledge of galactic political developments? How could they predict the timing of conflicts with such accuracy? The rescue operation proceeded smoothly. The Valiant Dawn matched course with the drifting research vessel, extended docking tubes, and began evacuating the stranded crew. But even as they worked to complete the mission, every eye on the bridge was drawn to the sensor display showing the massive human ship approaching the boundary of known space. Sir, the sensor operator reported. The human vessel has reached the boundary marker. It's stopped. The bridge crew held their breath as the readings stabilized. The human ship sat motionless at the exact coordinates that marked the edge of their restricted territory, like a predator waiting at the edge of its territory for the perfect moment to strike. They're listening, Kethvar realized. Monitoring communications, watching the tactical situation develop. They're waiting to see if their intervention will be necessary. Captain Zorthak studied the readings with the calculating gaze of a military professional. Or they're waiting to see if we'll notice them. This could be a test, a way of measuring our response to their presence near the boundary. Hours passed as the rescue operation continued. The crew of the Meridian Explorer was safely evacuated, their research data secured, and their ship prepared for controlled destruction to prevent it from drifting into human space. But throughout the operation, the human vessel remained at the boundary, a silent observer waiting for events to unfold. The galactic chart stops at human space, and everyone knows better than to ask why. The engine explosion that crippled the Valiant Dawn happened without warning. One moment they were conducting routine patrol near the human space boundary, and the next moment alarms were screaming throughout the ship as their main drive system suffered catastrophic failure. Captain Zorthak's damage control teams worked frantically, but the prognosis was clear. They were dead in space, drifting toward the one region of the galaxy where no rescue was possible. Engineering reports complete engine failure, the tactical officer announced, his voice tight with controlled panic. Auxiliary power will maintain life support for approximately 18 hours. Emergency beacon has been activated, but at our current position, he didn't need to finish. They were too far from any coalition base for rescue to arrive in time. Worse, their disabled ship was following the same gravitational drift that had nearly claimed the Meridian Explorer months earlier. In less than 6 hours, they would cross the boundary into human space. Kethvar watched the navigation display with grim fascination. After all his months of research, all the secrets he had learned, he was about to discover firsthand what lay beyond the edge of the galactic charts. The irony was not lost on him. The curiosity that had started this entire journey would finally be satisfied, though probably not in the way he had hoped. "Sir," the communications officer said quietly, "I'm detecting a transmission from within human space. It's directed at us." Captain Zorthak moved to the communication station, his scaled features showing the strain of command in an impossible situation. "Put it through." The voice that came through the speakers was distinctly alien yet strangely familiar. The accent was unlike anything in the galactic database, but the language was perfectly clear, standard galactic common. "Coalition vessel Valiant Dawn. This is Captain Sarah Chen of the human ship Quietly Competent. We are aware of your situation and are moving to assist. Please maintain your current position and prepare for emergency docking." The bridge fell silent. In over 2 centuries, no coalition vessel had ever received direct communication from human space. The voice was calm, professional, and carried the easy confidence of someone accustomed to dealing with crises. "Human vessel," Captain Zorthak replied after a moment of shocked silence. "We appreciate your offer of assistance, but coalition regulations prohibit—" "Captain, with respect, your regulations don't apply when your ship is about to drift into our space anyway." The human voice interrupted gently. "We'll have you sorted out in no time. The Quietly Competent will reach you in approximately 40 minutes. Kethvar studied the sensor readings and felt his understanding of physics strain against what he was seeing. The human ship had appeared on sensors from a position that should have required days of travel at maximum velocity, yet it was covering the distance in less than an hour. Either their propulsion technology was far more advanced than anyone had suspected, or they had been waiting much closer to the boundary than seemed possible. When the Quietly Competent finally came into visual range, Kethvar was struck by how unremarkable it appeared. The ship was sleek and elegant, but not in the way that suggested overwhelming technological superiority. It looked practical, efficient, like something designed by people who knew exactly what they needed and had built precisely that without any unnecessary flourishes. The docking procedure was accomplished with a smoothness that spoke of extensive experience. The human crew worked with quiet competence, their movements coordinated in a way that suggested they had handled similar situations many times before. Within an hour, the Valiant Dawn's crew found themselves aboard the human vessel, looking around with the wide-eyed fascination of people seeing something that wasn't supposed to exist. The interior of the Quietly Competent was surprisingly ordinary. Clean, functional corridors led to workspaces that could have belonged to any advanced starship. The only unusual feature was how quiet everything was. The ship's systems ran with an efficiency that produced almost no background noise, creating an atmosphere of calm that was somehow both peaceful and unsettling. Captain Sarah Chen met them in the ship's main conference room. She was medium height with dark hair and brown eyes that held an expression of patient weariness. There was nothing physically intimidating about her, but something in her manner suggested vast experience and unshakable confidence. She looked like someone who had seen every possible variation of crisis and learned to handle them all with minimal fuss. "Welcome aboard," she said, gesturing for the coalition officers to take seats around a conference table that looked like it had been designed to accommodate multiple species. "I apologize for the circumstances, but we should have your ship operational again within a few hours. Our engineering team is already working on the problem." Captain Zorthak found his voice first. "Captain Chen, I must protest this violation of established boundaries. The Treaty of Silent Boundaries specifically prohibits us from entering your space without invitation, Chen interrupted with a slight smile. Since you drifted into our space with a mechanical failure, we consider this an invitation for humanitarian assistance. Don't worry, we have no intention of violating the spirit of our agreement. Kethvar leaned forward, his curiosity finally overcoming his fear. Captain, may I ask how you knew about our situation? Our emergency beacon couldn't have reached human space yet. Chen's expression shifted to something that might have been amusement. Cartographer Kethvar, isn't it? The one who's been asking all the interesting questions lately. She turned to address the group as a whole. We've been monitoring your activities, of course. Not in a hostile way. Think of it as keeping an eye on the neighbors to make sure everyone stays safe. Monitoring? How? Captain Zorthak demanded. The same way we've been monitoring galactic affairs for the past 2 centuries, Chen replied. We watch, we listen, we pay attention. It's not as difficult as you might think when you have a few hundred years to perfect your techniques. Kethvar felt pieces of a puzzle clicking together in his mind. The conflicts that resolve themselves, the political situations that stabilize without explanation. You've been intervening all along, haven't you? Chen nodded. Occasionally, when things are about to get out of hand in ways that might affect galactic stability. Usually just a word, in the right ear, a piece of information shared at the right moment, a quiet suggestion that maybe everyone should reconsider their positions. But why? The question came from the Valiant Dawn's tactical officer. If you have the capability to openly control galactic politics, why hide behind the treaty? Why maintain the pretense of isolation? Chen was quiet for a moment, her expression becoming thoughtful. Let me ask you something. How old do you think human civilization is? The coalition officers exchanged glances. The oldest records we have of human activity date back about 300 years, Kethvar said. That's when we arrived in this region of space, Chen agreed. But our civilization is much older than that. We've been exploring, fighting, trading, and governing for over 10,000 years. We've seen every possible form of social organization, every type of conflict, every variety of political arrangement that intelligent species tend to develop. She stood and walked to a viewport that showed the stars outside. When we first encountered your civilizations, we recognized patterns that we had seen many times before. Trade disputes that would escalate into wars. Resource conflicts that would devastate entire sectors. Political movements that would lead to the collapse of stable governments. We had a choice to make. What kind of choice? Captain Zorthak asked. We could impose solutions, use our technological advantages to enforce peace, establish efficient governments, optimize trade relationships for maximum benefit. We had the capability to turn this entire region of space into a model of perfect efficiency and stability. Chen turned back to face them, and Kethvar was surprised to see something that looked like sadness in her eyes. But we had tried that before in other regions of space. Do you know what happens when you solve all of someone's problems for them? They stop learning how to solve problems themselves. They become dependent, then resentful, then rebellious. Eventually they destroy themselves trying to prove they don't need your help. So you chose isolation instead, Kethvar said. We chose to let you grow up, Chen corrected. To make your own mistakes, learn from them, develop your own solutions. We watch from a distance and intervene only when absolutely necessary to prevent catastrophic outcomes. The rest of the time we let you handle your own affairs. The tactical officer shook his head. That doesn't explain the treaty. If you wanted to help, why establish boundaries? Why the secrecy? Chen's smile was rueful. Because the alternative would be worse for everyone involved. Imagine what would happen if your governments openly acknowledged our presence. Every decision would be made with the question of, what will the humans think? Every policy would be designed to attract our attention or avoid our displeasure. You would stop being independent civilizations and become clients seeking approval from their superior neighbors. And you don't want that responsibility, Kethvar realized. We're tired, Chen said simply.